So when do we not want to see government being involved in many decisions, and why is that a problem? Well, there's a countless number of services or products that we really don't want government to provide. More importantly, so why do we not want government to touch those areas? Well, here are a couple of reasons. First of all, it's crony capitalism. It exists in many, many countries, and probably parts of the United States can see that as well. When whoever is closest to a politician gets the benefit from that politician. So in a way, if company wants to have a special treatment, they can talk to the politician or support politician in a certain way and get what they want. So that's what we call crony capitalism. The more government is involved in making decisions, the more crony capitalism we can see. Many times there's also bad returns on many financial decisions. Keep in mind that government is not motivated by profit, but more motivated by the political process. And the more money you spend sometimes, the better your chances are to be reelected. So some of the decisions made by our politicians are not necessarily best financial decisions. All of this is going to lead to the slower economic growth. So once again, once those decisions are not motivated by profit, we don't see as much growth. As a result, the whole country or the whole area is going to suffer. So when it comes to government regulation, so before we talked about government providing certain goods, now we're talking about government regulating particular markets. Some government regulations are necessary. The examples that come in mind are pollution, traffic control, immigration. There's a certain set of rules that need to be set by somebody, and government is that institution that set the rules. Some government regulations could be avoided. I specifically didn't include any examples because unfortunately there's almost too many of the regulations that are not really necessary from economist point of view. What do we have to keep in mind? That no matter what kind of regulations we're discussing, either necessary regulations or those that can be avoided, all of those regulations come with costs. That's what we learned in a class before. We talked about policies. So here it's very similar to that. No matter what kind of policy we're discussing, a good policy, a bad policy, necessary regulation or not so necessary regulation, all of those have costs. So let's look at the cost of regulation. So your book provided several examples that we're going to discuss. Let's talk about Milton Friedman and his lawyer's example. There are two possibilities. Lawyers can have either very, very high standards or somewhat low standards. It takes a lot of time to go through law school. It takes a lot of effort to go through the bar exams. As a result, we see lawyers that are extremely expensive, and no matter what kind of service you're trying to get, it's going to cost you a lot. So why not have some kind of a middle ground lawyers? Somebody who's going to take on easy cases and probably not always result in a very positive outcome, but we take that chance with the purpose of paying lower price. So some people will say, well, it's really not about the cost. When it comes to fighting over some issues, the costs don't matter. I just want to win my case. Yes, that's true. But is it really worth that high of a cost? Or is it better to take a certain risk and maybe not always get the positive outcome? It all depends. It all depends on the situation. Sometimes we may think, oh, I spend way too much money on lawyers. I could have gotten the same result with maybe low standards, the lawyers that have lower standards, right? So in that case, you're concerned of this cost of high standards. Cost of high standards is the price that you have to pay for high standard lawyers. What if the situation was reversed? What if a person hired a lawyer or received a lawyer for free, as it's supposed to be provided in certain cases to people who cannot afford lawyers, that actually didn't know what they were doing? That person is probably going to be extremely unhappy about the service they received. and they would talk about our lawyers having to be held to a higher standard. So cost of low standards is not really money, but possible cases that being lost due to the lawyer's incompetency. Deli workers example. We talked about deli workers and conditions in which they work and the pollution that's being created by the companies they work for. What's the cost of the pollution? It's the bare air that we breathe in. It's the bad water that people have to drink. What is the cost of pollution regulation? It's the jobs that being lost due to some factories no longer operating. That's what happened in the case of deli workers. When we started increasing standards of pollution was not allowed to happen to the standard it used to be. A lot of factories were closing, and as a result, a lot of workers were laid off. So that's the cost of pollution regulation. DDT and malaria. DDT is this powerful drug that kills malaria, right? So if we keep in the chemical, the cost of it is pollution that chemical is created. If we're removing that chemical, we're creating more cases of malaria since it has this power to kill that disease. So no matter where you go, you either pro that chemical existing or against that chemical existing. The problem still exists. It may be different problem, and once again we can argue which is worse. Is it worse to have this chemical, or is it worse to have this malaria? Is it worse to have pollution, or is it worse to have workers being laid off? Is it worse to have high standard lawyers and pay an extremely high price, or low standard lawyers and pay price of lost cases? So no matter what, each regulation is going to have some cost. So when it comes to regulation design, we have to remember that not all regulations are created equal. So once again, we're going back to something we discussed previous class. There's two different kind of policies and two different kinds of regulations. Command and control regulations, or those market-based policies that call to use the incentives. An example that comes in mind is the very recent discussion about soda bans in New York City. The previous mayor of New York City was trying to put the limit on the quantity purchased. So he said there's no longer going to be extra large sodas. Let's cap all the sodas to medium size. Or we could have come up with a tax that if you buy a higher quantity of soda, you pay tax. So the first one is an example of command and control regulation or policy. Another one is calls for use of incentives. So in the first case, you see what happened. People were extremely unhappy about that policy. Well, people are always extremely unhappy about any kind of new policy, but still, there were a lot of discussions that that policy is really not going to have any effect on the consumption of soda. People who want to drink a lot are simply going to purchase two sodas. And instead of buying one large soda, now they're buying two medium sodas, which in overall quantity may be higher than just simply large soda. When we impose a tax on soda, let's say we come up with a progressive tax, the greater soda you buy, size of soda you buy, the more tax you actually have to pay. That may provide people with incentives to reduce their consumption of that sugary drink. To maybe think about, hey, I don't really want to pay that higher tax. I'm going to stick with a smaller soda and drink the rest of the water. Once again, why do we want to have a tax on soda? For some people, it may seem like completely unnecessary tax, but in fact, the soda example is a tax on that good that may produce negative externality. That's the reason why we kind of want to regulate this particular market. Not so good regulations. Some regulations are purely bad regulations. We've seen a couple of examples in your book. Manicure example. When we impose high standards on manicures, in some city, those people who provide manicure services have to go through a lot of training. As a result, we see higher prices and less competition. Of course, on one hand, we can think about this being for health reason. On the other hand, that policy can be purely a result of a policy that aims to reduce competition in that particular market. Or Good Citizen example, where a person who needs to have a voting right had to go through some test and prove that he is a good citizen in order to be able to vote. Once again, the purpose of this is not really to help somebody, is not really to create the most efficient market, but rather to protect specific groups of people. Finally, how much is enough? Some governments fail the basic tasks of regulating property rights, enforcing the law, but support other heavy-handed regulations. So some governments are completely not concerned about those three basic roles of the government, yet they spend a lot of efforts to create other regulations. So your book is describing examples of helping hand versus grabbing hand. So that's an example when government turns from some helpful institution into grabbing institution, right? So instead of helping people to solve problems to function normally, government does exactly the opposite. The book also talks about example of Canada versus Vietnam and says that economies with lighter regulations tend to have better economic standards. It takes about a day or couple of hours to start your own business in Canada. It takes a lot of effort to start your own business in Vietnam. Supposedly, it's to protect the customers, to protect the consumers. In Vietnam, the government wants to make sure that that firm that's being created is not going to treat badly their customers. Yet we see that, in fact, we create the opposite situation. We're not allowing free competition. We're not allowing free markets to work. And as a result, economy suffers. So all of that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about government regulations. Some are good, some are bad. All comes with cost. Once again, important thing to remember, as long as the benefits overweigh the cost, we think it's a good situation.